Welcome to another episode of a tour on air, this time live. We do this from time to time, so we give our audience the opportunity to also ask their own questions to our speakers. I'm very pleased today to be talking to my good friend Lasse Clausen. Hola Lasse, who, as we have advertised obviously throughout our channels, is really a crypto heavyweight. You've been in the space for a few years. You've been very successful at, I think, not going for too much noise, but actually identifying the signal in this pool of noise that we see in the crypto world. So I'm very excited to be talking to you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great, to talk with you about this. We've known each other for years. We were part of the very, very early Berlin tech community, and it's been super fun just kind of seeing each other sort of journey throughout the almost decades now. I think we might even know each other for more than 10 years, and glad to be trying to share some of the learnings and the insights that we might have about crypto, because I understand it can be a very confusing and daunting topic.
I remember a conversation we had at Betty and Catty for breakfast, and you told me about this, idea of investing into the space and, raising a fund. And so I've been, following it up closely, and it's really tremendous, the success that you have. Just to give one kind of stat for the audience, you now have a fund with assets under management of well over $300 million.
It's actually $1 billion now.
Holy smokes. Yes, we had a few good weeks.
We've had some good weeks, and we started with $5 million in 2018, and we're now at $1 billion. I think, on the backdrop also, obviously there is, a big macro play, right? So unprecedented sort of fiscal response to COVID, and that mainly went into assets. So lots of money printing going into assets, and then crypto being sort of the main beneficiary of that. So, we're not all being geniuses here, but I do think we had, early conviction about the space, and we went all in. And I think really the difference was that in 2019, when, tokens were dead and prices were dead and nobody believed in it, we were more excited than ever. And we continued to invest heavily in tokens only. So maybe I can,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wanted to start, so we're gonna, structure this conversation a little bit in, sort of phases also, but I don't want to spend too much time on kind of the early phases of Bitcoin and Ethereum. I want to spend some time on kind of the 2017 to 2019, 2020 phase. And then we get to kind of the here and now, talking about, NFTs, DeFi, Metaverse, DAOs, spend more time on that, and then kind of get a future outlook of where the space is headed. And to everybody listening, please just put all your questions into the chat, and then Daniela will ping me with them. But before we get into that, there's two things I would love to address. One, kind of being your initial interest in the space, and then secondly, talk about a few of the basic kind of components or building blocks or primitives, or however you want to call it, in the space that kind of build the backbone of the blockchain, the crypto, the Web3 world. So initially, what got you so excited? And I hear you had a few tour experiences also with talks that may have triggered some excitement in the space.
Yeah, so I think always been basically a nerd and a tech nerd, and I love technology, and I was a tech entrepreneur. But you really kind of realize from the inside as well that this sort of Silicon Valley style, let's make the world a better place, it's actually quite a cynical play. And the second you have let's say Facebook, right? They're very friendly to developers. It's an open API. Anyone can build on it. And the second they feel that they have enough lock-in, from the users, but also, that there's enough developers that made that platform valuable, they just cut off the API access. And this literally happened. And you kind of realize that, this, at the end of the day, the core incentive of a company is really just, extracting as much profit as possible. And if you're a network, you want to charge your users as much as possible, and you want to pay anyone who's contributing to the network as little as possible. And it becomes kind of extortionate. It is really from a position of absolute power. And Silicon Valley has been very, very smart about specifically investing in these things, where you create technology dependence, right? So imagine your company and you're integrating all the software. Like Salesforce is genius at this. And now, all your top line revenue depends on people using Salesforce. But now if you want to add a tiny little thing, let me talk, sales agent, here's another module that we're happy to sell you. And you're kind of completely dependent and locked into this. And so, and Chris is the other partner at the fund. And I, he was my CTO and co-founder in startups. We really in the early days, remember we'd be like Friday evening, Jason Calacanis kind of like meetups and these things, very intrinsically driven to be in tech and to work on it 24/7. And, your friends go have brunch on Sundays. I'm going back to the office, just very, very, very excited about tech. And then once I really understood crypto, it was within basically 1 week that I lost all interest of tech. It was unbelievable. It was so obvious that this is the future, and all this kind of like Silicon Valley sort of startup nonsense is just trivial, and it's actually it's the past. And I think sort of to take a step back, or kind of how we see the space, or what we think the big thing is that trust really underpins all economic activity and trade. So I, for example, you can fix my windows and you trust me that I'm going to pay you at the end because I know you and you know me, and then maybe there's a person behind you that's your friend, and I think I can trust him because you also trust him. But then the person behind them, we don't know them and we don't trust them, and so you had typically banks kind of step in as a function, because if you want strangers to trade with each other, you need trust. And that function, very important function, has been taken over by institutions over the centuries, but it's also very, very expensive. So for reference, 35% of US employment is trust establishing functions. That's an auditor, that's a judge, that's law enforcement, that's an attorney, managers. So you get it's like an imperfect number, but I think it works that around 35% of the economy is just cost of trust. So for example, banking top line revenue is $4 trillion a year globally. And banks are essentially just a trust function, meaning that, I can give them my money and then nobody can come steal it because they've got big buildings with big steel bars, which are actually also pretty expensive to maintain. Then it turns out, but actually the banker can steal your money. So now you need the government to kind of step in and, create a regulatory process, hopefully having enough insight to prevent people from, the bankers themselves stealing your money. So that also becomes very expensive for the bank because now they've got regulatory compliance costs, lots of forms they need to fill, et cetera, et cetera. So all this becomes really, really expensive, but the essence is really just a trust function. And so again, you could roughly think that around 35% of all economic activity or cost or GDP is really cost of trust. And the remarkable things about blockchain is that it can manufacture trust at almost zero cost, and for two very, very simple reasons. Blockchains are essentially, they're just like a very simple computer system. So some computer logic, some code logic, and then a database. But the entire system is completely open source, meaning that every little detail on how it works, the entire code base, is actually open for anyone to look at and inspect and review. And so that means that if I put $100 million into a smart contract, I literally get mathematical cryptographic guarantees that nobody can run away with the money. But again, this only works because that entire smart contract is open source. And not only can I review it, but everybody else in the world can. And it turns out there's lots of smart people that actually like to do peer review. And they also take it apart and they write out their findings and they publish them. And so that's the first reason why sort of this technology creates trust at almost zero cost, because it's open source. And the second part is that it's what's called, it's decentralized, meaning that the control over this technology is not concentrated in the hand of few, like a board that, like on Facebook, decides, okay, now we're cutting off access to all, developers that built and made Facebook valuable. That doesn't exist, but the ownership or the control of this technology to change anything, to change parameters, is actually distributed among, ideally, everyone who used it or was a supplier or provided some value to the platform via what's called a governance token. And so, just the fact that I'm using something, it actually makes me now also a shareholder So the whole concept of like a user, a supplier, an investor, a shareholder, it all becomes one, is all expressed in this token. And if let's say I'm a company, again, instead of being dependent on Salesforce, I'm dependent on some smart contract, and then there's some parameter upgrades, some changes to this smart contract that would be detrimental to me. I can actually buy this token. It's a tradable asset. It's very liquid. It's on open markets, to try to determine the outcome of this vote so that it stays in my favor. So there's some indirect economic value for some participants of these tokens. But coming back to it, right? So these technologies, they create trust at zero cost, and they do so because they're open source, and there's no platform risk. But now when you open source, it also means that you don't have a business model anymore, because your core technology asset is actually open for anyone to review it, but it also means they can copy it. So the second, I start charging too high fees for anyone to use this technology, you could just fork it and say, you know what, I'm just doing the second one and it's no fees. And so I don't really have the traditional business model of a company of extracting, value through fees. And now, if you want to add some sort of form of incentive to it, because we've had open source software before, right? And apart from like very, very few, if you actually look at most open source code bases in the world, are maintained by one person. It's some lonely guy. He's just intrinsically driven to maintain this. But to really inject sort of incentives, economic incentives at scale, by that definition, you need a token already. And I think that's that's sort of the gist of it. Also, what we saw very early, that actually the exciting thing about blockchain is open source tokenized software. And that's hence why we have this sort of token only focus. But what your original question was like, what drew us into it was really this sort of understanding that this is a disruption. It's more a socioeconomic innovation versus a technology, yes, but it enables this completely new form of organizing humans around a common goal, which to this day, the dominant form is a limited liability company, right? It's the most common form of organization in the world, and that's usually how you align people behind a common goal. And here with blockchain-based open source projects, you have completely new form. None of these are companies anymore. They don't extract fees in the typical way. And so, and I think that's what really, with the background where we did Silicon Valley startups, and we kind of really understood that this is actually like a pretty dirty game to just push people into dependencies and then, become, uber rich, and everyone else kind of suffers and just has to go along with it. We really saw like a systems, or like a structure for systems where, basically everybody wins, and you don't have this one party that's in a position of absolute power that can then use it to their advantage. I think, sorry, that's a very long-worded answer to why do we get so excited about this space. And as you can tell, right, it's quite complex.
But I think you've done a great job kind of talking about those essential building blocks that I did want to talk about also in the beginning here of the conversation. And I think it's almost like everybody gets excited about maybe even a different kind of building block of what this technology can provide. For some, it's maybe this trustless security that you spoke about, that is based on principles of cryptography, decentralization, consensus. For me, what I find personally, really triggering my interest is this open permissionless access, which leads to composability, right? Where what you were saying, if you don't like the take rate of a given network, well, you could fork it, you could do it differently. And I feel like that, those Lego parts being able to build on one another is just an incredible driver for innovation, and likely will be in the future. What I do wonder, though, is how are you fending off competition then in a world? In the old economy, it was all about creating barriers to entry as well, right? For your company or for your product. How do we think of barriers to entry in Web3? Like, how do networks and dApps kind of win over competition then?
Yeah, I think the general dynamic is that it is easier to join the network than try to start a competitor, because you don't really have the incentive anymore. Like, why would you not want to join this network? Because so I think that's the first overall dynamic, where it's less of a competitive field, but it really just makes sense to join an existing network. And even just the fact that you're using it, you're already, usually in the initial, let's say 10 years, the inflation actually goes to distribute the ownership of this network to anyone who uses it, right? So the friction to have vested interest in this network is so low, because you just put some money into some DeFi protocol and automatically you start actually being distributed the quasi ownership of this network. The mode of these things is, it's not the technology, but it's actually the social consensus that this is a standard. And so the only thing that has stronger network effects than protocols are physical railways and internet cables. Other than that, protocols are have incredibly strong network effects, because there's social consensus that when someone says, I don't know, internet of money, half the people that know even about this immediately think of Ethereum, for example. I'm not going into which one, but just the fact that this is top of mind, this is a agreed standard, and we don't have to say, when I tell you, hey, can you send me $100? You immediately know that you're going to send this to me on Ethereum or Solana, whatever it is, right? You just know, right? And so I think this is really where the moat comes in, is in the social consensus that this is the standard, and it's a Schelling point, right? Everyone agrees that this is the one that we use. So this is also where we focus on. So our focus is really helping founders bootstrap networks, because that's essentially where the moat comes from, or the defensibility comes, that you are creating in the early days a community of early adopters, innovators that sort of are excited about the technology, they're excited about the mission, and they sort of contribute to the network, they drive it forward, and they help establish it as a standard.
And when you look at the adoption cycle, then this also sounds like we see an explosion now of networks, and I guess we have already in the previous cycle that you've been a part of as well. When you say that it is maybe easier to join a network than start your own network, will we therefore not see that many networks after all? Like, how much is winner takes all? And I know this is a huge tribal debate in the industry, right? Where have maximalists on many sides, on the Bitcoin side, on the Ethereum side. You have challengers such as Solana, obviously Polygon, and you have the Polkadot ecosystem and parachains and multi-chains. And how do you make sense of that as a network investor?
Yeah, this is it's a never dying question, and I think if the space continues to grow the way it's been growing, we will probably have a few big networks, just because there's so much demand for block space that now Ethereum is constantly above 100 way, just because there's so much demand for it. I do think eventually we'll all fall back to one common standard, because it's just easier. There's an advantage to. This is Peter Thiel, right? There actually is an advantage to a monopoly. Now, the good thing is that here, that monopoly is structured as a public good, and it doesn't enable three guys in the boardroom to extract value on the entire society, right? So I'm comfortable using the word monopoly, because you can't really use it in a malicious way.
Why is that, though? If I may interrupt, though, Lasse, like, why wouldn't the network owners, and this is also where I still have to wrap my head around, I understand the technology sort of advantages of it, but like from a governance perspective, in theory, a public company, is also represented or controlled by its shareholders. Why wouldn't token holders and that governance form in the crypto Web3 world not also want a higher take rate? Because that could lead to maybe a more valuable network.
Because I think the competitive pressure is much, much, much higher. Because if that social consensus sort of flips, right, and everyone else sees, okay, this is, it is actually a small number of people that own the tokens, and they're, they're exercising excessive rent extraction here on everyone else. Again, in theory, a lot of the technology you could just fork it over. It's not that easy to just fork it and you go. But the competitive pressure, and you see this with Ethereum as well, right? The second Ethereum got a little bit complacent on the roadmap, immediately you had very well-funded teams kind of going after their lunch, and Ethereum also itself had to really pick up their slack. So I just think that you will still have this struggle between sort of, okay, rent extraction or fees, But at the same time, those fees, they actually go to the validators. There's no Vitalik sitting in the middle with a Swiss foundation that's taking a cut on every fee. That fee is actually just distributed towards the people that are actually verifying these transactions. And the overall incentive is just culturally of the whole network is really to make this as accessible as possible and increase the throughput and lower transaction fees.
Will we then, and just one more question on this because I find it really interesting, will we then, this take rate question, and because there's obviously the argument, I think Chris Dixon has done it a few times in his podcast, Spotify, for example, has 6 million artists, but only 15,000 of those make more than 50,000 euros a year, which is obviously nothing compared to the fees that the rate that Spotify is taking. But ultimately, if we need so much scale in those networks, we need the size, we need the volume, so that small take rates can actually also lead to a healthy distribution to validators, to the ecosystem. Also have funds in developing the platform out. Will the entire technology landscape thereby maybe not be as diverse as we would want it?
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good question. We're already seeing this, right? There's just a lot of advantages to everyone using Spotify. I prefer that you let me play this on Spotify because I have it, and it's integrated. A lot of Sonos, etc., have just a very easy way to use Spotify. Now the problem is that again, Spotify is controlled by like a small board, and can arbitrarily, the second they feel confident, they're going to increase sort of the extraction, which again, that only goes to passive capital. The fees that Spotify is charging really, it just goes, okay, pay some costs, but it really goes to like passive capital holders. Whereas if most of these protocols really, they don't have an actual take rate in there. There's a fee, but that goes one-to-one to anyone who's actually providing the value, right? So you could think of it Spotify, which is the same way it works now, but instead of Spotify taking 25% in the middle, you really just have 100% of what I'm paying actually is going to the artist and nobody in the middle. So I think,
how then are the ones? How are the builders of the network incentivized?
Yeah, so usually the way it works, right, that you have a tokens that sort of ties the whole thing together and aligns all the different participants. And you would say if there's 100 million token, you maybe have 5 million tokens for the team, or maybe 10 million around. That's kind of the balance. And that is also distributed over 5 to 10 years. And because it's a tradable asset, there's some value to it. And this is how you can fund yourself. And then you can say, okay, in order to get the first, $5 million to build this thing, you pre-sell some of those tokens to us because, you need the capital and you need support to get this thing off the ground. But in the long run, it's really, the idea is to create these self-sustaining communities, because, and we've seen this before, where, it's an open tradable investable asset. And these networks might languish a little bit. There's not a lot of momentum behind it. And then some actors come in and they invest, they buy up some supply, and then they start, contributing resources to it. And saying, okay, we want to actually make this more valuable, more useful, because we'll also have financial incentive for the token. Usually the price reflects that. If they're well designed, right, it's still an open space, but generally the token, if it's well designed, it is some correlation between, if a lot of demand for the network or the utility of the platform correlates with an increased demand for the token. And maybe, or for example, is less supply of the token, meaning that there's a lot of transactions, you need a lot of staking. To stake, I need to lock up tokens. And so, it's a huge open design space on how to generally design it that if there's increased demand, the network is useful, it has specific functionality that's useful to me and to other people. And the more people, make use of that network, there's either, increased token demand or decreased token supply, one of these things. So you have this, again, you have this indirect way to monetize. You don't have it through fees and sort of rent extraction, but you have an indirect economic correlation between usefulness of the network and, token scarcity.
Great. I think, that's been super useful. Thank you for, shining a light on, sort of the incentive part of it, the crypto economic part of it. And let's shift gears a little bit from kind of networks to applications. And this is where, for me, it actually made click. So we've had, as you may know, we've had sort of content around blockchain at Tor for many years. So from a theoretic point of view, I always found it, intellectually stimulating. But from a usage point of view, it took me also really quite a while to start playing around with it because it was, not very easy, not very intuitive. But once I did, and it was more than just going on Coinbase and buying some crypto, but it was really when I started creating a wallet and connecting a wallet to different applications, where the user experience, became actually awe-inspiring and incredible. So it's almost like you have to go through this kind of tough part of getting to the point where you have maybe a wallet, a Chrome wallet or something extension, and you go from dApp to dApp, you connect your wallet, and you bring all your data and your assets with you. And that's a really powerful experience I found that you can find in DeFi, but also with NFTs, maybe in the easiest and simplest forms. And that I feel has really gained steam in terms of adoption and interest into the space. So, what's your take on where we are at this stage, in the hype cycle, in, sort of adoption of these things, seeing the interest go from DeFi, maybe more to NFTs, now to DAOs, the metaverse, all these kind of new expressions floating around with actual use cases that everybody can, test here and there.
I do actually think we're still really early, similar to, you had, if you wanted to go on the internet, you had to go to store and pick up this CD package and then come back home, or, mail, wait for it in the mail. And then you had to like install this whole thing on your computer. And then, it took like basically weeks to get on the internet. And I think the equivalent, and then once you had that moment where I'm sending an email, I'm sending text to anyone in the world right now, and it's instant, and they can reply back to me, or even ICQ. I mean, that for me was like an equally an awe moment, right? Where you just, similar to having made up, a wallet on your desktop, and you're just taking all your data and all your money from one application to the other, and you own that data. So for me, that's a similar moment. But actually, to get there, like you said, it's taking a long time. You need to sign up to Coinbase. You need to send them your passport. They need to verify it. It's similar to the time where you had to go out, go to store, get the CD, go back home. A lot of sort of real world friction in between. So I think from that sense, actually, in terms of onboarding, we're very, very, very early still, and it's still pretty broken. In terms of usage, what really helped is I think, and we've underestimated the impact of is of NFTs. And I think NFTs, it's like art or JPEGs of monkeys or something like this. But in the more macro sense, NFTs are property rights for the digital economy. And that is actually really remarkable, because the fundamental building block of any society are property rights, right? If you looked at the Soviet Union or anyone else, you didn't have property rights, and everybody wants out. And so it's actually really crazy when you think about it, that we spend so much of our life online now, and we never had property rights there, right? Any piece of data that we have, you have to assume that anyone can take it, and you have no ownership of anything. And it's fine, because that's the worldview. But then once you realize, like, I have rights now, I have property rights on the internet, I think that's a very, very profound moment. And I think NFTs represent that. And like, I don't know, an NFT that represents a Picasso in someone's vault is also interesting, because it adds, very, very frictionless financialization and trade of this asset. But I think it's more important that every piece of data now is actually property, and can be, and enjoy property rights, can be financialized, can be traded, and it also has, very efficient enforcement of those property rights. Because the second that you have, as long as you have your wallet, nobody can take it away from you. And I think that's what we also we're so used to, when you're in crypto for a long time, you're so used to that everybody's first reaction is like, no, is to fight it. This is a scam, whatever, this is bullshit. And it's, it's a diverse space. So there's enough bad things you can pick out to make your argument that the space is nonsense, right? So we were very used to that every industry just originally fights it. What really surprises is that the creative industries immediately jumped on this. there were a few sort of high arts people that were like skeptical, but I think it's fair to say that pretty much the entire creative industries full on jumped into NFTs. I don't know if you saw that Quentin Tarantino just created, there were cut scenes from Pulp Fiction, I think a total of 7, and each one of them became one NFT now.
Wow.
Yeah, so now we're there, we're at this stage where, and I think it is because the creative industries realized they never really had property rights either. They always had middlemen, studios, gaming companies, whatever in between. And now they actually have property rights, and they're going down, and and they own their content, they own their creation, and they can do with them whatever they want, and they can commercialize them directly, and they don't need anyone in the middle of that. And so,
and they were the most screwed by Web 2 in a way, no?
I think so. And so that is, to be honest, something we didn't foresee, that it was going to become so big so quickly. And what's also interesting is that, for the future of crypto, that, the creative industries, they really shape the culture for the rest of society. They're very, very influential. And now they're full on board with this. And so I think the sort of growth outlook, or let's say at least the time frame until we sort of really, really hit mainstream is been massively accelerated.
It also seems to me like the narrative in the beginning, a lot of it was on, people on the mainstream thinking about, Bitcoin or then Ethereum as kind of a means of, transaction or, money, digital money and so forth. And probably people saw that was so difficult to implement. I mean, not that it may not happen, but, now we see, all these different applications that can actually work, without, having to actually get into existing banking structures, etc. But they can really fly on their own. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I think for us, this sort of very early, it was completely broken, it was really hard to use, but still this just crazy excitement from our side. Like I said, right, within 1 week we just lost all interest in tech and said this is so inevitable. I think it's because we're technologists by background. I think there were just some fundamental technology differences that we saw, and that we were very comfortable having the faith that this is going to be big. Even though, from the user side, it was absolutely terrible. But it's also okay because an internet of money, it's called sort of a software stack. And at the very, very bottom, you have protocols, the same way that if, you have protocols that are running the internet, and just for us to have this video conversation, nobody even knows of, right? And then there's tons of middle layer software in between, even just the software that runs the protocols in the network switches, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, right? If you have an inner backbone connection or something like this. And all this stuff needs to be slowly built up. And then, 15 years later, you have like a very nice to use FaceTime app. So it just takes a lot of time. And we were just concerned that when are the application layer entrepreneurs arriving and actually, building very beautiful user experiences on top of that. It was actually a young team from India that was the first one, because we were really said this is extremely important. We need to at some point attract these, UI entrepreneurs. And I think it was 2019 that a very young team from India, they won a hackathon, and they built a very, very beautiful interface on top of some DeFi protocols. And again, this is the magic that you were describing, right? Anybody can build a UI on any of these protocols. It's not that, this is the Facebook DeFi app. That means that only I have to log into facebook.com or Instagram to be able to use this financial application. It's a protocol at the bottom, and then anybody can build any UI on top of a website and app that uses this protocol. And the user just signs in with their wallet, has all their data, has all their money that they're just taking from one application to the other.
Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, often talks about how he would like to see more, use cases, applications for blockchain technology, and sometimes almost laments a little bit, how much oxygen DeFi has gotten in the space. What do you see as key growth areas in crypto? Where will we see, new applications and maybe unsurprising areas?
I think it's already there. I think he got what he asked for. It's NFTs. I think that massively extended the space, right? And even in terms of, if you're looking at sectors or indices, DeFi definitely has lagged this year. It's really everything that NFT related has absolutely blown up. I think there's still this, sort of to extend this property rights across into the real world. In theory, the technology, everything's there. It's just the social consensus challenge. So for example, let's say that actually the ownership of my house is actually not anchored into some office where a lady with a stamp is, and I have to go and queue up Mondays and Thursdays from 9:30 until 11:45, and Tuesdays. But it's actually just in my wallet. It's an NFT, and if the second I send the NFT to you, it means that you own this house now, right?
Yeah, or you can fractalize, and kind of fractalize the ownership, which I find really exciting.
Right? You can financialize it, right? You can all these DeFi. Yeah, you can make this a financial primitive, and then DeFi, you can do all these, financialization of it. That technology is already possible. The only challenge is here is the social change, right? How do we get everyone from me to the 80-year-old grandma whose house I want to buy? How do we, when are we ready that everyone agrees that, it's in my wallet and I'm sending it to you, and that means like now we transferred the house title. I think I think it's a generational question. Because when you grow up with this as a possibility, like, you can do it. But if if you lived 60, 70 years of your life where the reality was, or it just existed in a way that you had to go to some office, certain office hours, queue up, take a ticket line or something, and then like they go back and they have these huge files and they pull the paper out and everything. That's just the way things work. It's very hard for you to say, okay, look, I'm throwing all that out of the window, and now the fact I just have this iPhone and I'm sending you this thing on a wallet, and now it means you're on my house. Obviously, that's a big sort of societal kind of shift. But I think with generations that are growing up where this is even a possibility, because the problem is when you grow up and this is not a possibility, it's very hard to switch to that. But when you grow up and this is already the reality, maybe not everyone's using it, but this exists, and I think that switch will happen in a couple of generations.
I see your German distaste here for lines and queuing.
Bureaucracy, oh my God.
Last question now, from my side, because you just mentioned it, and it actually relates to one of the questions we have from the audience. Mario is asking, how would you successfully tokenize an asset? So this kind of, this transfer of the technology into the, physical realm of our economy is something that I remember having early discussions, a few years back with people in the blockchain industry. They weren't that excited about, and they'd be like, no, first, like, let's build stuff that is really native to the technology, rather than thinking about, let's say tokenizing, an asset like a building or an ESOP, for example, that I know a team is working on, or probably many are, for company ESOP shares. But is that something where you see, if the future really had it, that, the technology will really infiltrate into the physical realm of the economy?
It could be, maybe. I think we're generally more excited about sort of really, instead of trying to adapt the technology to fit an old world, you just create a completely new world, and that itself becomes so much more attractive, frictionless, easier, that everyone sort of gravitates towards that one. So I'm much more excited about tokenized or NFT ownership of, I don't know, something that's, of software, of something that's already digitally native versus, and like tokenizing the Picasso in someone's vault. And so I think that is, I don't have the answer on how that bridge is ever going to get closed or how that will happen. But generally we only focus on sort of crypto native innovations and not trying to adapt a new technology to, accommodate it to corporates or, real world assets or these kind of things.
So let's dive into some of the audience questions. First one by Anonymous. I don't know if it's the Anonymous. With such high macroeconomic volatility, inflation, money printing, etc., where do you see the largest upcoming opportunities for arbitrage value capture in the crypto world?
It's a very specific question. I think, yes. So it really, part of this massive increase in the market cap of crypto is because it's an everything bubble right now. I mean, I think secondhand home prices in the US on average increased 16%. It's just that 40% of all dollars in existence were printed since COVID, and so I think that's and crypto is a risk on asset. So if equities go up, crypto goes up 2x. I don't know. I think the best thing is just to have some cash in the sidelines and wait for maybe a pullback, and then whenever it crashes 50% from all-time highs, you just invest a little bit, and that's it.
So that's definitely something you see happening also.
We're not macro traders.
Yeah.
We're not micro traders. The way we counter it is that, yes, we do raise more money so that we have reserves should something reset. But in the meantime, we also still see incredible teams, raising at moderate valuations and building really, really groundbreaking things. And we just invest in that. Whether, generally, I think trading, we're not traders at all, and we don't advocate for trading. I don't think anyone really trades successfully. I think it's just...
It's not timing the market, but time in the market, right?
I think that exactly, right? And just over a long term, because everybody who sold Bitcoin in 2017 at like 18,000 felt really, really smart, for like 3 years. And now they're feeling pretty dumb about this. So I think just, long-term view, this is, I think, as profound as a change as the internet itself was. And if you think about it, I mean, the first time you used like maybe internet, you felt this is amazing, this is an aha moment. But you had no idea how big the impact was on everything, right? It was just, you couldn't imagine it because it never existed before. And so I think in the same way that we're all sort of instinctively, this is going to be really big, but to be honest, I still think we're going to underestimate the impact in the next 20 years. Because it's going to enable a lot of things that just never existed before. And those are, of course, extremely hard to imagine because not everybody's a science fiction writer.
Insaf is asking, she's actually part of our TOA Founders Club. As a brand, a company that makes clothing, how important do you think it is to launch the brand within the metaverse, and at which stage?
I think this is really important because you have, if you look up, I think like, almost 99% of consumer spending is actually not utility, but it is social signaling, right? Because I could just buy, the simplest, whatever, Kia to take me from A to B, right? That's pure utility. But there's also a lot of reasons why I'm buying something else, or I don't know, maybe a Tesla, right? Even because I want to signal also to other people that, hey, I'm progressive. I understand there's some, there's a lot of social signaling. And I think fashion particularly is even more on the scale of social signaling versus I need to be not cold. I need to be clothed. And I think this will translate to the digital world as well already, right? If you look at Instagram, I mean, there's a lot of people that live their life to create cool Instagram pictures, and they get all their social validation this way. I'm not advocating for it, but this is something I'm seeing. And I think in the metaverse, which is just a bigger, more exciting name for the internet, basically, you will have the same principle. I think that's unique. That's persistent throughout human history and all cultures and all ages, is that people want to signal other things to other humans, to their tribe, and get feedback that they like this. And I think scarcity is a huge part of it, because you can only, value only exists when something is scarce. And now you have the first time ever in digital scarcity and therefore digital value. And I think it's going to be really important there's going to be huge demand for people to signal a very unique asset on the avatar, etc. And we already see it, right, with Twitter, that people put, an expensive sort of NFT as a profile picture to signal to everyone, like, hey, I own something of scarcity.
Frein is asking, two questions. One I'm going to combine with Claudia's question, but Frein is asking, what do you think of shitcoins, meme coins, dog coins? Are they hurtful, or are they creating buzz and getting people into the space?
So this is interesting, that, it comes back to cost of trust. And when you have trust, it enables a lot of markets and a lot of different things. And one is lottery, right? Lottery also traditionally needed a trusted institution to say, this is all fair. And and I think the meme coins and these things, they're essentially a lottery product. I've had this, I arrived in the US, the immigration officer asked me what I'm doing here. I said, I'm going to crypto conference. He said, I also have one, I bought, what do you say, for $100, I got 17 million coins. Imagine they're going to $1, right? So that's the same thing why people play the lottery for 1 week or whatever time. In their head, they want to think, wow, if I'm going to be rich, this is what I will do. This might make me rich like overnight. And that's what I think is behind the meme coins. It's essentially a lottery product. And this was before you had a lottery monopoly, because that was the only, trusted institution or trusted institutions only allowed that product to exist as sort of, for 1 week, I want to imagine what it's like to be rich. And I think now, again, with crypto, you can manufacture trust, you can manufacture markets that people trust enough in to say, hey, I'm going to put $100 in here. I don't care if it goes to zero, it doesn't matter. Instead of going out partying, I did this, but hey, maybe it goes to $1 and I'm going to be a millionaire.
Christian Buss is asking, are you still long-term bullish on ETH despite the recent run-up? And maybe we combine it with a question of Christoph. What do you recommend people that have not so much clue but believe in crypto? Where and how would you invest 20 to 50K today? The inevitable question.
Yeah, I get, no investment advice from my side here. I can't give investment advice. I think, again, like never, ever trade. Never try this. Yeah. It's very tempting. It's very addictive because you can look at the price. Like every second, you could be a little bit richer, right? You buy some and then you look at the portfolio. Am I richer now than I was like 2 seconds ago? It's very tempting. And I think coming back to Ethereum, it's the social consensus is sort of the sticky part, right? And I was thinking this. I'm in a hotel and I sign things and they take it almost as money, right? You can, if you go to a hotel, you can like get, anything. You go to the hairdresser, you can order food, you get massages, everything, and you just sign. So the signature is like a really terrible technology, right? This is super forgeable. It's very old, but there's social consensus around it, right? The waiter doesn't even think, like, sees my signature. Okay, this works. And so I think this kind of speaks for not always the best technology wins, but once you hit sort of enough social consensus, then it's really hard to die out. And I think Ethereum might be on that point, maybe. For example,
also with lots of innovation coming, right? Like to make it faster and cheaper in terms of transactions.
Yeah, there is a lot of well-funded teams. So the market is incentivized to figure this out, and it's happening. There's incredible talent being extremely well-funded. So the technical challenge is sorted. Now it's
hashtag CK Sync.
Hashtag ZK Sync.
Which is this is a reference here with a total addressable market of probably 1. But no, that's a company that Lasse is invested in, but that works on layer 2 to make those transactions faster and cheaper, right? Which people that may in the audience have bought an NFT recently will have suffered through the fact that fees are still very high on Ethereum.
So it just depends if there's some other chain that really gets broad, very diverse, and you don't need the immediate sort of social consensus. You usually first need developer consensus because they need to build like a plethora of like interesting applications. So it's still open, but I think every day that Ethereum kind of is not losing is the day that Ethereum is winning.
A related question somewhat to investing, of course, you being investor, there's lots of interest in that. Vishal is asking, with your view that NFTs are the way forward, would you advise investing? Yes, you're not going to advise, but maybe what are your thoughts in general in terms of NFT exposure over tokens, networks, and even staking for someone who wants more skin into the crypto game?
Yeah, I think in theory, right, this is the exciting part about investing in like a layer 1 is that you don't even need to be that smart to know any of this stuff. And that's the thing, right? You just invest in Ethereum and now it's OpenSea, which is an NFT marketplace, is the number 1 gas burner of, for Ethereum. So before it was DeFi applications, now it's very diversified. So I think that's the beauty also of these layer 1s or crypto in general. You can invest broadly in the adoption of the Internet of Money. You don't even need to pick individual winners. And so Solana, whatever you want, I think is one way to get that exposure and have the market figure out what is the most successful one.
Maybe one related question just from my side on this. I didn't want to dive too deep into DeFi, and you can keep it just broadly. But when people, and I've had people also reach out to me and ask me and send me screenshots of like yields that are 1,000 plus APY. KlimaDAO being one as an example, right? And people are wondering like how can some of those networks actually pay such high yields for people who are staking in these so-called incentivized liquidity pools? I mean, is this something that is just outer-worldly, stay away from, or is there an economic, incentive, underlying economic incentive model that actually makes sense?
Yeah, so I think one really interesting thing is that these networks, instead of giving Facebook and Google like $100 million to let people know about your product, you are actually giving your users $100 million to use it, right? And that in turn then attracts a lot of users, and obviously the yield is funded by their governance token, right? And so again, it depends if people actually buy into this thing and think, okay, in the long run, I think this is valuable, and I'm happy to buy it from someone who just farmed it with yield, right? That balance has to be right. And the second that everybody's farming and nobody thinks it's valuable, and they're all just selling it the second they get it, then it's unsustainable, and that's, you see the yields just like crashing. And sometimes they stay pretty elevated. Generally, depending on like how, if you don't have an audit, it's a new chain, if there's a lot of technology it's risk, it doesn't attract that much capital, and the yields can stay like in the 10-20% range for a long period of time. Usually what I've seen is like 5 to 11 to 15%. I think that's kind of like the yield that is sustainable. There's one project called Anchor on Terra, which essentially takes, you get staking yields, which means transaction fees, which are around 11% sustainably, because people are paying $1 to do a transaction on Terra, on the Terra blockchain. But you can put US dollars in, so you don't have the exposure usually to the native asset where you're staking Luna, you're getting the 11%, but Luna can go up and down in price. Here you can just actually use US dollar, you have like a price stability, but then you're still getting the transaction fees. And so anything you see above 20% is probably medium term, short term. Anything you see above 100% is definitely a matter of a couple of days, because it'll just attract a lot of capital and then you dilute the yield.
So then I'll just browse through some, and sorry to the audience if we may not get to all of the questions, but I'm just trying to cover a few of the grounds here. So one being, regulation, which we actually haven't talked about yet. So I think that's an interesting question. Just have to find the name again. What can regulators do to assist more in mass adoption of the crypto blockchain world?
I think my general tendency is actually don't do anything. You're gonna fuck it up. The odds are that you're going to screw it up. If you now if you visit a website in the EU, you kind of know what the end result of regulation is, right? Another example is, hey, Facebook and Google is really too powerful. It's very hard for startups to compete in Europe. So the EU introduced some privacy laws, and it turns out that it's so expensive now to comply with that actually now Facebook and Google are more powerful than ever. So I think while mostly regulators are well-intended, I think it's hard to, whenever you implement or forcing something at such scale across like entire continent, entire countries, it's really hard to predict what the actual result will be, right? Nobody predicted that the result would be that we have pop-ups now. After Google fought them successfully for years, pop-up ads are essentially back. Every time you visit a website, you have this annoying pop-up where you need to click some cookie consent. And so I think the first thing is to make it, is to probably not do anything and let this play out a little bit. I think obviously in these bull markets we see, we do see a lot of frauds. And I think honestly, the long-term sustainable solution for this is, while allowing it to have permissionless innovation, because regulation kills that, right? You cannot do anything anymore unless the government signs off on how you do it. I think is investor education. Like, people need to just understand that if something promises you 100%, there is no free lunch. It's coming from somewhere. And, you need to actually check whether, some form of educating people about actually something being open source, being actually peer reviewed. Is it trustless, or is this sort of just, a web app running on AWS and they have all, control of your funds and they can just take it away anytime?
This one, just if you have one in mind, any interesting, projects in the climate space, in the crypto?
Not yet, and that's very careful with KlimaDAO and everything, because there are a lot of projects that are taking advantage of people's desire to solve climate change. I think the Energy Web Foundation is interesting. It's a very long-term play of basically providing open source free operating systems for energy grids and network operators, etc. It's just a very long-term thing, because those power plants, it takes a long time for them to ever upgrade their operating system, if they ever do.
I think this is a very specific question by Derek Ryan. For social media type applications, high ticket volume, would you still go for ETH plus ZK Sync or something else like Flow?
It's a good question. I think there's some interesting stuff happening around Arweave, where, because a big part of social media is the data storage. So I think a chain where data storage is the core of it, and scalable data storage and trustless data storage is interesting, but I think we're not there yet. I think on Ethereum obviously makes zero sense. ZK Sync has ZK Porter, which is a very fast scalable way. Even that I don't think makes sense to have every being an on-chain transaction. It doesn't make any sense. So we're not there yet. I don't know if Flow is the answer. Otherwise, I like the founders. I just met them in Zurich. But it depends how big that ecosystem can be. I don't know yet. It's still open. Yeah.
There's a question on NFTs, and I can actually have a plug in here because maybe it's an artist, somebody asking, what's a good way to market NFTs? And that also, I just want to maybe make the announcement that we're going to be launching an NFT club for artists. So getting artists through a 4-week program to launch their first and mint their first NFT. But Lasse, any general tip, any platforms? I mean, super rare.
We're investors in Rarible, so we obviously recommend Rarible. I do think they have a great job of, I think with a couple of clicks you can actually create an NFT from your Instagram feed. So things that are in your Instagram, you can actually make an NFT out of them very easily. But to market is still, you're still going to have the same challenge of marketing anything else. That's just hard. Just because I saw some people, they thought they don't know crypto. It was like, hey, I'm going to create an NFT and all the crypto people are going to buy it up. That's not the case. You're still going to have to, create a community. You have to have a story. You have to have people that, like what you're doing, and then maybe they buy your NFT.
Maurits is asking, and I swear we didn't ask him to ask this, is Tor already developing a blockchain solution or a token? And, maybe I'll, ask you, because it's something that, we're thinking generally of, kind of how in our cohort-based learning club, to better incentivize all participants, the people that share their content, speakers, even such as yourself today, but also people that, help one another. We see that actually happening a lot. They're actually now all flying to Berlin to meet for the first time in a self-organized meetup, which is amazing, which we didn't even think would ever be something that they would be doing. Do you think, like, tokenizing, I mean, communities,
100%.
is that,
100%, it makes sense, because you should have the ownership of that community should be with the community. And the way to do that is either with an NFT or a social token. So we already see really fun where it becomes very easy that you have to have a token in your wallet in order to access a Discord or a Telegram group. Right? Sort of token gated communities. Again, the tokens are tradable. It sort of gives you an idea, because adding some, financial incentives to it just makes it more fun and like playful. Again, this is not super serious, but it's, it's kind of fun to see, like, hey, this community right now is being valued like this, and there's people who actually want to pay for it. And it's also a nice way to pay back to the initial people of the community. The token was worth zero, but they made the community valuable.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very organic, scalable way to actually say, hey, I was super early. I was in the chat every day. I moderated. I was part of making this valuable. And now the tokens that I have in order to access the community, now they're worth like 10 times. And because other people find this community valuable now, and they're happy to pay for that. So I think 100% you should tokenize any community.
We're getting to the end, Lasse. Maybe just lastly, for all the people who may be thinking about, joining the space, working in the space, there's tons of job opportunities out there. Correct? I mean,
unbelievable. The funding is there. They're all well funded, and they're all dying for talent. You'd be surprised how successful some really stupid people are, just because they're in the space and they're proactive and they're participating. So you don't need to be super smart. You just need to be a bit of a self-starter. And the cool thing is also the friction to enter the space is almost zero, because you can just join a Discord, listen in the conversation, maybe, and you always have people coming in asking some user questions. Maybe just start answering them, because you already know, hey, this is how I connect my wallet to this and that, do that. You start answering those. I can tell you within 2 weeks, 1 week of being helpful, the team members will pick up on this and they will offer you a job. And it doesn't mean that you have to fly and do interviews, sign an NDA and a work contract. No, they will just, the multi-sig owners, the token holders will vote on paying you, every month something very quickly. And we've had this with one, he was ex-army, did some Afghanistan tours, joined one DAO called Index Co-op, and just wrote a newsletter once a week saying, hey, these are the things that happened. We talked about this was the outcome, this was a challenge. And 2 months later, he's basically leading the project. He raised a $10 million growth round from us, and it just very quickly up. And I think it is actually, because we do have like high youth unemployment. And the reason is, again, regulation. Politicians wanted to protect the labor market, so they made it very hard to fire people. And the result is that nobody wants to hire people anymore because you can never fire them. It's a lot of risk. And I think this is a very nice counterbalance that, it is extremely frictionless to join these DAOs and be a contributor. And you don't need to be a software developer. They really literally need anything, and particularly people that can communicate, guide communities. Guide community sentiment is also very, very valuable. And you can join those within a week. You will have a job.
Lasse, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. We didn't get to all of the audience questions. I'm sorry about that. Maybe we'll have a encore eventually to check in with you and see how things are going. Best of luck, and I'm very proud of the success that you've had. So to the moon. All the best.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.